I turn these 3 thrifted men's shirts into a shirt dress full of ruffles? Let's find out. Hi, my name is Matilda and welcome back to Miss Matti. Last year I watched Angelina from Blueprint DIY make her dream dress that combines both masculine and feminine elements, and I was super inspired and wanted to make my own version. But I didn't want to copy her. Instead, I really just wanted to use her dress as initial inspiration and use sort of the same elements in my dress, like that masculine boxy fit with loads of ruffles. I wanted to use this light blue shirt as my base and then create the ruffles and other details with the 2 patterned shirts. I put the light blue shirt on my dress form and put a pin where my shoulder ends and started to mark where I planned to put my ruffles. I'm going to remove the back from the yoke and take off the sleeves. I measured the width of my shirt and marked the new shirt width. I drafted a new armhole from the shoulder width marking until the new shirt width, and then drew a straight line to the end of the shirt. Using my fabric shears, I then cut following these lines through the front and the yoke. And then I cut off the back piece close to the edge of the yoke. My plan was to add the flower pattern shirt on the back, so I cut off the back piece of that shirt. I then, off camera, created gathering stitches at the top of the back piece and lightly gathered it until it fit the width of the yoke. Then I pinned the back of the yoke to the back and stitched together. I started to remove the collar because I wanted to create a banded collar instead. I removed the breast pocket, and to remove the stitch marks, I pressed it with my iron using the steam setting. I will later on add another breast pocket design, but I wanted it to be a more fun design in a contrasting fabric instead. To create my ruffles, I wanted a mixture of fabric from all the 3 shirts. I used the back piece of my light blue shirt and cut it into 3 pieces. And to create the ruffles from the floral patterned shirt, I initially tried out the idea of using the front pieces with the button band intact. Then off camera, I overlocked the top edges of my ruffles and then started to create the gathers. Before proceeding, I decided to play around with the ruffles on my mannequin to help me decide on the ruffle placements and length. One thing I noticed whilst making my sewing plans was that after me and Evelyn Wood did our zero waste men's shirts challenge, I really couldn't let go of the zero waste mindset for a while. My mind definitely went to how to use it all. I wanted my shirt to have a partial bottom band. I also pinned my partial bottom band in place to get an idea on how it will look when finished. Once I had a clearer idea on what to do, I top stitched the yoke and the back piece together, as well as top stitched the banded collar together. I cut off the excess bottom band fabric and snipped the seam allowance at the top near the end of the bottom band so that I could sew the pieces together without creating any puckering. I found that I made the process of stitching the front pieces together way more complex than it needed to be, but it was a lot of mental gymnastics for me to make sure I got it just right. Do you also have certain steps of the sewing process that you just can't get your head around? Then I pressed the fabric to remove the previous folds and stitch lines. I wanted to create a French seam, so I pinned the wrong sides together and then sewed in place. Then off camera, I folded the seam to the wrong side, pinned in place and stitched to enclose the edge. When I came to the end of my seam, I decided to close the French seam in place by turning my work 90 degrees and then stitch towards the edge and then fasten. When cutting off the sides of the light blue shirt, I cut off a bit too much because I didn't think about my hip measurements, only my chest measurements. Therefore, I decided to create some extra width for my hips by adding a triangular piece of fabric to both sides. Before sewing these pieces to the side seam of my dress, I folded the hem in place by pressing it up 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch, and then I top stitched the hem fold in place. Then I sew these pieces to the front piece using French seams, which will be how I stitch together most pieces in this dress, with the exception of the ruffles. Before we stitch the front piece to the back piece, we will need to lengthen the back piece by adding one of my ruffles. I decided to add the bottom back piece from my light shirt as it has a nice curved edge that will ensure my bum is covered when wearing the dress. I sewed the right sides together and then I folded and pressed the seam downward and top stitched in place. Despite my best efforts to not create any puckering at my bottom band, I accidentally did it anyway. I figured out that I could seam rip my bottom band open and then hide the excess fabric inside the bottom band. Then, before sewing the side seams together, I wanted to attach another ruffle, this time at the front in the light blue fabric as well. Once I had stitched it in place, I pressed the ruffle downward before proceeding to make pockets. I had seen some beautifully gathered pockets on Pinterest, and I wanted to create that for all my pockets, including my new breast pocket. To create my breast pocket, I cut a rectangular piece with 2 rounded corners on one of the long sides. To decide on how wide piece you need to cut, you need to decide on how wide you want your finished breast pocket design to be. And then, depending on how much gathering you want, add extra fullness to both the top and bottom of the pocket. Before creating my gathers, I folded the top edge of my pocket down by 1/4 inch, pressed, and then folded another 1/2 inch down, and then pressed again. And then I top stitched the pocket edge in place, 1/2 inch away from the edge. To create the gathers for the breast pocket, I base stitched at the top, starting and stopping around 1 inch away from each side. Then I base stitched at the bottom of the pocket around 1/4 inch away from the edge. Once I had gathered the top and the bottom, my pocket looked like this. Then I pressed the pocket to create a more structured look to my gathers. And then I stitched the gathers at the top of the pocket in place. I also sewed around the pocket to help me fold and press the seam allowance. Then I pinned the breast pocket and edge stitched it in place. Once my breast pocket was attached, it was finally time to sew the side seams together, once again using French seams. At first I wanted to create pockets for the side seams, but I found it created a bit too complex seam structure that also could result in creating too much bulk. So I decided to go with another pocket design instead. Instead, I wanted to make 2 pockets, which I will place at each side at the front of the dress. To make my pockets, I cut out 2 scoop-shaped semicircular pieces of fabric, to which I had added extra fullness to at the top so that I had enough fabric to create gathers, as well as 2 strips of fabric to use to bind the top edge. Then I gathered the top of the side pockets. Once I had gathered the top edge of the pocket to my target measurement, I pinned the fabric strip to the pocket right sides together. Then I stitched the strip to the top edge. I pressed the seam flat and folded the binding strip over by 1/4 inch and pressed. I then folded the strip in half towards the wrong side of the fabric and stitched in the ditch on the right side of the pocket to secure in place. Off camera, I overlocked the remaining raw edges of the pockets and then I stitched around 1 centimeter. And using the seam, I pressed the seam allowances in place. I then pinned the pockets to one side of each dress, and then I base stitched them to avoid puckering while stitching the pocket in place later on. Sadly, I lost the footage of me stitching the pockets in place on machine, but the main thing to think of is to edge stitch the pocket in place, and when you come to the binding, sew a little triangle which you stitch around twice to fasten securely. After I had sewn the pockets to the dress, I decided to stitch 2 other light blue ruffle pieces a bit above the pockets to be able to hide them as well as to create more volume. Once the 2 ruffles were attached, I then folded them downwards and pressed in place. On the back of my bottom band, I had some raw edges that I really couldn't figure out how to hide in a good way. So I thought maybe I could just attach a patch to enclose the raw edges. I cut out a little patch from the check pattern fabric, which I'd folded and pressed the raw edges on. And then off camera, in a contrasting thread, I base stitched the patch in place as I planned to attach the patch using my sewing machine. And I wanted to prevent my machine from creating any puckering. And I can confirm it really made a difference. I decided to attach all the check patterned ruffle pieces together in a circle. As my pieces were of different width, I decided to adjust the width of the longer piece and attach it at the back of the dress. To attach it to the shorter ruffles, I snipped the seam allowance to the length of the other ruffles. And then I folded and pressed the remainder of the edge inward twice. I then top stitched the fold in place, and then I stitched the back piece together with the front ruffles to create a circle. I then pressed the seam towards the center back, and then I had to take a break to thread my bobbin. This project used a lot of thread. Then I threaded my machine and top stitched the pressed seam in place. I folded the bottom of the bottom band upwards as I wanted to attach my ruffle piece underneath it. And then I measured out exactly where to place the ruffles and then pinned before sewing the ruffles in place. This is how it looks when stitched together. To make sure that the bottom edge of the partial bottom band had a neat finish and didn't fray, I decided to attach a little piece of fabric underneath it to enclose the seam allowances. I cut this piece from the underside of the cuff on one of my shirts, as this fabric was thinner than the rest of the shirt fabric, and I didn't want to create unnecessary bulk. I snipped the seam allowance just above where I will attach the piece of fabric and then pinned the patch to the edge of the bottom band right sides together, and then stitched around the triangle shape. I then cut off excess fabric from a patch and snipped the seam allowance at the corners. Then I turned it inside out, making sure to pull out the corners properly and pressed in place. Then I pinned the bottom band to the dress and top stitched in place. And at the end of the triangle shape, I stitched across the bottom band as well. Then it was time to create the ruffles for my arms. Off camera, I stitched together several pieces of fabric to create 2 circles from the floral patterned shirt, and turned the edge over twice and pinned in place. I also made sure to overlock the other edge. Once I made sure that the 2 pieces were the same length, I pinned and stitched the last seam together. Once I had done that, I made sure to fold the edge over twice at the seam as well and then pressed. I then top stitched around the 2 circles, and then I gathered the overlocked edge on each circle until their measurements were similar to the armholes on the dress. Then I pinned and sewed the ruffles to the dress. This is how it looks attached. At this point, I thought I was done and put on the dress off camera, and I absolutely hated it. I was so disappointed as I was going on holiday the next day, and I had envisioned taking photos of the dress in the English countryside. Instead, I sat in a beautiful English garden, cutting off excess fabric with a pair of fabric scissors that had seen better days. But now I am getting ahead of myself. The ruffles stood out too much at the armhole, so I thought it would look better with ruffles at the top of the shoulders only. So it was just to revise it. Things not working out as you planned is part of the sewing process, and something that happens to all of us, no matter our years of experience. I removed the bottom of the ruffles on both sides and tried to create a smooth edge by attaching the sides to the armhole as well. And as it was a success, I repeated the same process on the other side as well. Then I wanted to enclose the seam with bias binding. And now we are back in the English countryside again, cutting off excess fabric before base stitching the bias binding in place and then hand stitch the other edge of the bias tape to the dress. Once the bias tape was fully attached, I removed the basting stitches before addressing the other issue with the dress. I wanted a boxy dress, but it turned out too boxy, so I thought cinching in the waist a bit would make a difference. One of the solutions I tried out was to create dots at the back, but this method didn't work out either, so I decided to remove the darts and then try to just create gathers at the back instead. To create as even gathers as possible, I had to unpick the whole ruffle towards the front so that I can smoothen and even out the gathers to fit the new waist measurement. Using my seam ripper, I removed all the buttons as I want to replace them with real shell buttons. Then I started to attach these vintage shell buttons to my dress. And once I had done that, my dress was finally done. I find that refashion projects are perfect when you just want to get those creative juices going, and this project was definitely one of those. I guess this is because when you are refashioning, you need to work with the limits of the garments that you have, and that really forces you to think outside the box. But now let's check out how the dress turned out.
Notice that you were checking for me. We were just friends, but we started building trust, and my fragile heart started to mend. Yeah.
I really hope you enjoyed following my creative journey in making this dress, and until next time, bye!